Everyone, and welcome to the first and only Pest Control Officer webinar of 2026. My name is Chelsea Newberger, the Plant Health Technical Advisor for SARM Division 5, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. All attendees will be muted during the duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This webinar is eligible for continuing education credits for structural, rat control, and industrial vegetation licenses in the regulations category. If there's more than one person watching from the same computer that wants continuing education credits, please let me know. My contact information is located within the chat box and on the SARM website. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the SARM website within the next couple of weeks. Third-party recording and transcription tools are not permitted during this webinar. Okay, today's presentation is on biosecurity and livestock operations. This webinar will be presented by Michaela Waller and Tyra Dickens. Michaela is an animal health and welfare specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and Tyra is an animal health and welfare veterinarian with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. On that note, let's get started. Welcome, Michaela and Tyra. Take it away.
Perfect, thanks so much. So we can just hop right into it. So as stated, we're going to be talking about biosecurity for livestock operations, and particularly for yourselves as pest control officers, kind of some things to think about. What is biosecurity? What can you do to mitigate some potential on-farm risks? So we'll just go, if Tyra can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
The first one on my screen. There we go. Perfect. All right. So what is biosecurity? So biosecurity is a concept rather than any one thing, and it refers to practices designed to prevent, reduce, or eliminate the introduction and spread of disease. So those practices can be further divided into two categories: external practices, so how we can keep disease off the farm or from entering the farm in the first place, and then internal practices, how can we control the spread of disease or eliminate that disease if it does happen to get into our farm, and how can we prevent that disease from spreading to other farms. So if we could imagine each farm, if they could operate within their own bubble, would be ideal, but we know that that's not possible, and that kind of that bubble or that dome, if you just pop to the next slide, Tyra, needs to be permeable, right? We know there's people, animals, equipment moving on and off that farm each and every day, and each one of those movements on and off the farm poses a potential biosecurity risk or a potential for the introduction or spread of disease. So why is biosecurity needed? Our number one goal with biosecurity is to protect the health of our animals. But there's also a few factors that are important as well, and we'll just talk about those. So infectious disease can also impact producer livelihood. We know that our livestock folks in Saskatchewan and across Canada as a whole are depending on their livelihood through the sale of those animals. So if disease is introduced to animals on a farm, there may be direct losses to the producer through mortalities, increased cost of production due to treatment required, as well as physical and mental health challenges for those producers, especially during a large-scale disease outbreak. And kind of something we could think about there was the HPAI outbreaks that we're seeing in the spring and in the fall, and just the toll that those are taking on the producers as well as the animals. Secondarily, infectious disease may also impact human health. Lots of our livestock diseases are zoonotic, meaning that the disease can transfer from humans to animals and vice versa. So this can lead to illness, possible death in some cases, for individuals working on the farm, but also in proximity to those. So if one person is working on a farm and they go back to their household, they're also capable of spreading that disease to their household, even though the household has no direct contact with the farm. Another impact is public health. So some zoonotic diseases, again, those diseases that can transfer between humans and animals, can also be passed through contaminated food. So think E. coli, BSE or mad cow or salmonella. So these kind of foodborne illnesses can lead to death in very severe cases and often illness, and that's not something that we want to do. And what Saskatchewan and Canada is looking to do as a whole is provide safe food to our consumers. So there's also the potential there in a large-scale disease shortage or in disease outbreak that there could also be mass euthanasia required or shortage of food for consumers. So again, if we talk about HPAI, there was lots of layer barns involved. So there was actually an egg shortage in Canada because lots of those animals needed to be humanely euthanized. And lastly, infectious disease can also impact international trade. So as I've said, most of our livestock sectors rely on international trade or export. And if a certain disease is present or detected in Canada, those borders are immediately shut and we can no longer export some of our live animal products or animal byproducts. So that could lead to a surplus of animals. And in certain barns, if those animals aren't able to move out, their space requirements then turn into a welfare concern. Perfect. So we'll just kind of get into the principles of biosecurity. So there's 3 principles: risk assessment, separation, and cleaning and disinfection, and we'll talk about each one of those in detail. So number 1 is risk assessment, and this is exactly as it sounds, kind of some questions to ask yourself, to ask the producer prior to going on farm to determine the potential biosecurity risk of that farm, as well as the potential biosecurity risk you may be posing by entering that facility. So some questions to ask could be geographical location. Is the farm in close proximity to other farms? Mingling sites like an auction yard or processing plants where those animals go for end of life. How big is that farm? And a part of that too is how many animals are on that farm, in what sort of area, how many species are present on that farm, what are the age of the animals, because each one of these factors can either increase or decrease kind of the risk of disease. So if there's multiple species present on the farm, that is an increased risk of disease, as well as the age of those animals. So we know that animals at the very beginning of their life and the very end of their life are more susceptible to disease. Farm design, again, so this comes back to the number of species present, the density. Are those animals housed indoors? Are they housed outdoors? What sort of contaminants, bacteria, pathogens are they exposed to naturally if they're housed outdoors versus those species that are housed indoors and see very minimal contact? Is the farm a breeding farm or a finishing farm? That kind of speaks to how many movements are happening on and off the premises each day. So based on those questions, you can determine the risk associated with that farm. And if it's determined that there is a higher biosecurity risk with this farm, some additional biosecurity measures should be put in place to help you mitigate some of those factors. So I just have an example here of a farm. So this farm, here's just some information about the farm, is located near other cattle producers but shares no fences. The farm is not near any mingling sites or processing plants. They have 100 cow-calf pairs that are exclusively raised outdoors, as well as a 1,000 bird broiler operation that operates on an all-in, all-out indoor housing system with 2 cycles per year. So some of those pre-visit risk assessment questions, the no shared fences, that's an important feature. So that means that those animals are not typically coming into contact with other animals. That is a lower risk of disease incursion or disease introduction. However, having multiple species on the same premise increases that risk of disease incursion. And then if we get into a little bit more detail about how those animals are raised, so for their cow herd, it's a moderate sized herd, and those animals are raised outdoors. So they're naturally exposed to some things and would have natural immunity to those. So that decreases that risk of disease incursion. However, there may be certain times of the year where that disease risk is a little bit higher. So that could be during calving season for the animals as well as for the humans. And then if we look at their broiler operation, a rather high stocking density, we know that poultry are typically raised indoors, and kind of that all in, all out system that they're operating leaves those animals more susceptible to disease just because they aren't naturally exposed to things that are existing in the outside environment. And again, those young animals are most susceptible to disease. So some strategies we could use to mitigate some of those risks that we identified is you could visit the most susceptible species first. So in this case, the poultry are going to be the most susceptible because they're housed indoors. So you could visit that barn first and then move into the cattle pasture or any other buildings in the cattle area. You could also change your boots or clean and disinfect them while traveling between the two barns and before entering, as well as arrange the site visits outside of the calving season or 7 to 10 days after those chicks are initially placed. So that just gives those young animals some time to gain some immunity either from their mother or from their environment before you are potentially introducing some additional risk to them. Okay, principle number 2 is separation. There we go. Technology is always a bit of a struggle. All right, so principle number 2 is separation. So again, exactly as described, good biosecurity practices encourage separation under lots of these circumstances, but basically separation is creating a barrier between the risk and the animals that we are looking to protect. So for yourselves as pest control officers, some of those pieces of separation or where you can create separation between the risks is by using PPE, personal protective equipment. So that would be boot covers, gloves, masks, etc. You could have barn-specific clothing. Ideally, you would have barn-specific equipment, footwear, vehicles, etc. And if not, you're able to clean and disinfect those items before you're taking them to a new premise. Barn entry, which we will talk about in the next slide as well, is a big part of separation. So how are you coming into the barn? What are you doing? And again, before you leave, how are you creating that separation? For the producer, and this is just information for you to know, how the producer can potentially create some separation on their own premise is by housing animals of different species and by different age separately. So if we have young animals housed with very old animals, those are the most susceptible species, and they may be transmitting disease back and forth to each other and creating more risk. New animals, it's a very common recommendation that any new animals to the farm are isolated for a given period of time, and that's to create that separation. Same thing with sick animals. We would ideally move those animals away from the rest of your herd or the rest of your flock to create a level of separation to ideally eliminate or prevent that spread of disease. And then lastly, rodents, birds, and other wildlife. So this is exactly what you as pest control officers are out there looking at, but the producer should be worried about it as well, is keeping those wildlife and other pest species away from their animals because those animals are potential sources of disease. So just talking a little bit more about the barn entry. So a very easy way to kind of think about this separation and how you can work to create separation is to think of everything outside of the barn as dirty and everything inside of the barn as clean. So before you're going into that barn, how are you going to take your dirty footwear or your dirty equipment into a potentially clean space? And Tara, if you just want to hop to the next slide too. I'll continue chatting, but ideally barns will have some sort of physical barrier, such as a bench or a marked line on the floor to separate the clean or dirty areas. So this would be a very good example. We can see that kind of white square on the outside would be the exterior barn door, but then if we enter into that, we have some sort of transition zone here in the gray, and that's an area where the dirty footwear, the dirty equipment can come in, and we have the opportunity to change our boots, apply boot covers, clean and disinfect prior to entering that clean area. And then just to the next slide, If no such transition zone is available, that's totally fine. We would just use that exterior barn door here, the black square, as that physical barrier. So remember, the outside would be the dirty area, the inside of the barn is the clean area. So just prior to you transitioning through that barn door, you're going to want to apply some level of separation there, so you're not bringing anything with you from the exterior to the interior. And then just on the next slide, I'll kind of chat us through as Tyra gets it going. This is just a very good visual representation of how you can think about the exterior as being dirty and exactly all the things that your hands, your feet, your equipment could potentially be touching, and how that physical barrier is a really good kind of visual guide to help us make sure we're not going to exterior. You're removing that dirty footwear, slipping only with clean items into the clean space or the transition zone. You're just going to clean and disinfect his hands, and then step into the clean barn dedicated. So that's a great example, and then there's just a few bad examples of how we can improperly use this barrier. Very simple changes are very small, subtle changes, but if you take your footwear off and then you're then placing your socked foot down on the dirty side, your socks are potentially picking up any pathogens that you had on the bottom of your shoes. So just really important to kind of, once you're working in this space and you see it, it does become natural, more so how to do it properly, but we're just kind of walk you through it today and give you the information you need. So that last principle, cleaning and disinfection. So these words are often said together, but they're actually two separate things. So cleaning refers to the manual removal of microbes or debris. So that's physically brushing off the dirt, brushing off the mud from the bottom of your boots. And cleaning usually uses a soap or a detergent. So quite often we could even think about washing our dishes, right? You're quite often washing your dishes with soap, so you are cleaning them. The secondary step, if you wanted to then disinfect those dishes, you would need to use a chemical or a physical sanitizer to destroy any potential pathogens on those plates. And the same would be true for your boots or any equipment that you're using. So cleaning ensures that the disinfection has adequate surface contact with the pathogens that we are trying to destroy. And there's kind of, as I mentioned, those two different disinfectants that you could use, a chemical one, so that would be a hand sanitizer or a disinfectant, or a physical disinfectant. And some pathogens can be destroyed using temperature, using UV light, or through air filtration. So just in summary, before I pass it off to Dr. Dixon, so biosecurity is a concept rather than one thing, and it refers to practices designed to prevent, reduce, or eliminate the spread or transmission of disease. Why do we care? Because infectious diseases have a much larger impact than just on animal health. And those three principles of biosecurity are risk assessment, so determining the potential biosecurity risks and how can we mitigate them. Separation, so that speaks to the mitigation. How can we prevent or reduce possible transmission between those risk sources? And lastly, cleaning and disinfection. So the physical removal through cleaning, as well as the chemical removal or disinfection of those pathogens.
Awesome. So we'll move on to another section, going on farm, and some of the more specific details dealing with that. So again, when we are going on farm or when we are using biosecurity, we can ask, when would you use biosecurity? So when would you use these procedures to keep disease out? And oftentimes people tend to think of just on farm when you're there, but actually it's before the visit, during the visit, and then after. And why would we be doing this? So a lot of the reasoning behind biosecurity is, as Michaela had talked about, the disease prevention side of things for the human health side, as well as other implications of poor biosecurity or things that happen, such as disease and border closures, which are kind of down the road after. But that's ideally what we're doing, is we're trying to prevent that morbidity and mortality from happening. And of course, protecting ourselves. There's Salmonella, for example, is a bacteria that causes illness in animals. It causes illness in humans, and it's one of the leading causes of foodborne illness. And it's very easy to contract Salmonella from feces, from manure, and not only poultry, but other animals as well. So really, when we're talking about our lines of defense and our biosecurity measures, when we're going before, during, and after, the personal protective equipment is really your last line of defense. So by the time you're putting on your coveralls or you have gloves on, you're already likely going to be exposed to some pathogens or some disease-causing agents. And ideally, we would do those preventative measures like procedural or prior to site arrival, as Michaela had said, like your pre-visit questionnaire, and just leaving things off farm. So there isn't that potential for contracting disease. A breach in biosecurity, any breach could lead to disease. And this is not to scare anyone. This is a reality of going on and off farm for producers, for anyone that's working there, as well as anyone that's auditing them or anyone needing to do visits. But this really is true. And there's a lot of research to back this up, that simple breaches, like if you're forgetting to take your boot covers off or clean your boots, you're walking outside, highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI that Michaela was talking about, is transmitted. There's wild waterfowl carry it, the low pathogenics, all the time. And so it's in their manure all the time. So when it's high pathogenic, that's the one that kills more domestic poultry and kills them quickly. But I mean, that's outside all the time. If you're not removing your boot covers or having clean boots before you go into the barn where the animals actually are, the poultry in this case, then it's quite easy to bring in that virus. So something we don't often think about is travel history, and why would this matter when we're talking about preventing things like foreign animal disease that we don't have in Canada yet. We look at, were you traveling, like on Friday, did you come back from overseas? Were you in Vietnam somewhere where they have African swine fever? Those kinds of things. And then at work on Monday. And just there are implications if you've been to a place that has some of these diseases, that you can bring it on farm, whether it's in your respiratory tract or whether it's in the boots, the same boots that you wore there. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then asking questions to the producer before you come, such as, is your herd or flock under quarantine? Are you dealing with any big diseases or major diseases? And it may sound silly to ask them, but oftentimes either they assume sometimes people coming on farm know these things about them, or sometimes they're used to it. They're dealing with a disease, or they're under quarantine for, say, highly pathogenic avian influenza or bovine tuberculosis, and they have just forgotten to share those details. So recording the date and the location that you visited somewhere is important. I don't know if you sign visitor logins for, especially like in the barns that you go into. Either way, if you can keep a record on your own, that's something that's important in case there has to be trace back done if there is a disease outbreak. And considering time between farm visits. Now, this one's a little bit difficult sometimes, depending on when the visits need to be set up. But again, what you can do before being on farm is, if that's really the time that you can maximize the benefits of biosecurity. So ideally, in a lot of situations, if there's disease outbreaks, you want to leave 72 hours or 3 days between visits. But again, it depends on the disease and the risk. And I mean, you're not responsible for knowing all the diseases and everything that's going on farm, but these are just some things to think about. And potentially, if producers mention any of these things, you can ask for more information, or you're at least aware of them. So that was the scheduling of appointments. As Michaela talked about, going from lower risk to higher risk. If there's a farm that is dealing with a disease outbreak, or more likely they're closer to waterfowl and you're going to be doing a bunch of poultry visits in the next couple of weeks, then you can maybe schedule those accordingly, so that the higher risk farm is the last one you see that day, that way, rather than the first one. If the first farm you see is, and I'm not sure how many visits you would do in a day, but just say you were doing 2 visits, and the more concerning one, the higher risk one, you do that first, and then you go to the lower risk one. That's just, it could be avoided if you know the circumstances. So following the protocols that are already in place is a really good way to do it. That is something that there are standard operating procedures, and producers may or may not have them. They may or may not tell you about them. But if it's something obvious that you can follow, then it's a good idea to do so. It helps you and it helps them. So in this case, there is a big warning: you are entering a biosecurity area. Please wash your hands before entering and exiting. Following those SOP or standard operating procedures is a good thing to do. The other thing is, if there ends up being a disease outbreak, then you can at least know you did what you could to help prevent that from happening. Personal protective equipment. So it may go by a little bit personal preference and situational, but this could include boots, goggles, gloves, hair or head covering, and then coveralls or a gown, so that your body is covered that way. And staff ideally should be trained in putting on, donning and doffing the clothing or the personal protective equipment. And again, as we saw in that video, you're not always thinking about everything you're touching and what order. But I mean, if you do everything, say you wash your hands with soap and water too early, and then when you're leaving the barn, you're taking off your dirty coveralls or your dirty boots after and throw them in the laundry or throw them in a garbage bag to wash later and walk out the door, and the last thing you've done is touch the dirty coveralls before leaving. Even though you did wash your hands with soap and water, it wasn't done at the proper time. And then you end up dealing with that potential for transmission of disease outside the barn. So the biosecurity measures can mitigate potential exposure for domestic flocks, for example. And I'm using this as a big example, the highly pathogenic avian influenza, because this was a big deal. This happened in 2022. There were cases in Canada, and this was unprecedented. And there ended up being a lot of whole flock euthanasias, a lot of disease. Michaela mentioned like all the economic offsets to that, the egg shortage, price increases in some situations. So this is still an ongoing problem, although we're more used to it now because it's 2026 and it's been going on for 4 years. But initially, this was a big problem, and prevention was, there was no vaccine. There's no vaccine to prevent avian influenza or highly pathogenic avian influenza. And so biosecurity is what people were relying on to prevent this disease from entering their barns. And you might have had to stop farm visits. There were a lot of visits that were stopped during these time periods to prevent disease. So just some of the efforts here to prevent disease from entering the barn, doing things like deterring or excluding wild birds from entering the barn, or especially where the domestic flock is housed, decontamination protocols for employees and vehicles entering the site, and then ideally when leaving, but not feasible in a lot of situations, and then ensuring that infected and dead animals are properly disposed of. And again, you're not responsible for some of that, but to give you a bit of an idea about how we use biosecurity to try to prevent disease and things that you could be aware of. So operational and structural biosecurity typically involves practices and standard operating procedures designed to prevent the introduction of disease into production facilities. And the other important point here is the current recommendations are based on expert opinion as well as epidemiological evidence and experience in recent outbreaks. So epidemiology is study of disease, and anytime there are big disease introductions, especially unexpected and diseases that aren't common, there's usually investigations going on. This was Canadian Food Inspection Agency is the lead on highly pathogenic avian influenza because it is a reportable, like a federally reportable disease, but they look into like how are the possibilities that this spread, and then how can we prevent that in the future. So there are changing recommendations for biosecurity and keeping disease out. And in avian influenza, one of the big focus areas was the entrance. And like, because is it coming in? I mean, we know enough about the virus, but also with the research that was happening at the time that these outbreaks are happening, that was determined this is one of the big areas that we need to spend time on, and not so much, the air vents or other things. So, I mean, people, and then that entrance area where you can have the most impact on preventing that disease or virus from entering. So again, going with your pre-visit questions for the risk assessment from the beginning to try to avoid the visit or change the timing, scheduling, do all you can do preventatively before you're on the farm. Separation is a huge one. Like, vehicles are so difficult to clean and disinfect, and the tires are a source of a lot of disease movement that way. So vehicles should not enter the livestock areas, only taking essential items into the barn and really even into the truck. I mean, in Canada, or at least in Saskatchewan with our winters, we need to take precautions and have extra things in the vehicle sometimes. But even those kinds of things, if you have a clean area of the truck, really limiting what you have there, because it will become dirty after you have left the barn or the premises. And then putting on personal protective equipment for our purposes or your purposes, definitely stressing that clean boots, whether it's booties or clean boots. So thinking of that on barn entry and on barn exit. And then washing hands with soap and water really on entry, because you're not wanting to bring in any disease, and then on exit for your own safety, and then also so you're not bringing disease out of the barn. And cleaning and disinfection, and this part, the cleaning, if the cleaning isn't done, there is no point in doing the disinfection. So things like bleach, which are good at disinfecting, that doesn't work with organic material. So if you take boots that are full of manure and soil and you pour bleach on it, it does nothing. So it only works on clean surfaces, and it only works when you have that proper concentration, so amount of bleach to amount of water, and time period. And a lot of this is the time. Oftentimes, a lot of these disinfectants need at least 10 minutes of wet contact time to be effective. So here's the biosecurity toolkit. If you are moving around and going from one farm to another, what you can pack. So personal protective equipment, recommended boots and disposable boot covers and coveralls. So the treaders are, I really like those, and a lot of people that have to use walk-in booties a lot like those ones the best. We do have a resource, next slide here, about where you can get them from, but they're clear plastic. They tend to be a little bit, depending on your height, I guess, a little bit higher, and not just covering your actual foot and shoe, it higher up on the leg. They have an elastic, and the bottom is like almost like corrugated plastic or rough plastic, so that you have, I mean, as much traction as you could with with plastic booties. So additional items if there's heightened risk, or depending on if you have respiratory problems, an N95 mask, disposable coveralls, disposable gloves, hairnet, and safety glasses. And then for cleaning and disinfection, bucket and scrub brush, garbage bags, Rubbermaid tub or other container for dirty clothing or footwear, alcohol-based hand sanitizer and disinfectants. And if you are using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer, it's definitely preferable to do the washing your hands with soap and water, but again, in a lot of these barn or pasture situations, that's not available. So then doing alcohol-based hand sanitizer, but the alcohol should be at least 70% alcohol to be effective. You can get some that are 60% or 50% or lower, and those are not, generally speaking, they're not effective to kill the pathogens or disease-causing agents that we're concerned about. And then for disinfectants, we have bleach is awesome. I mean, it's easily available. It is corrosive. So, I mean, depending on what you're using it on, you have to keep that in mind. But using that solution and then other ready to use solutions are disinfectants that can be used in following the label recommendations. So here's the where to purchase personal protective equipment, and Mark's Work Warehouse is really excellent as far as boots and coveralls. And this is always the tricky one. You do want boots, ideally with treads that are easy to clean, yet at the same time, if you've ever walked in boots in the wintertime, it gets very slippery, especially when you're outside and things kind of freeze up and you're like, that gets difficult. But the tread can keep, if there's a lot of tread there too, it keeps that manure and that soil in there, and it's very difficult to remove it. And Aclan's, Granger, Canada, Uline is where you can get the treaders from. Farm Barn is another one that you can get some of those other disinfectants from. That one is in Ontario, I believe, but it's an online, they have an online store. So what diseases are we concerned about? And again, you're not expected to be disease experts, but just understanding some of the background. There's diseases that animals transmit via people. So a big one in the swine industry, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. So PED, we don't have it in Saskatchewan yet, but it is in Manitoba. And this is a big one. Oftentimes it's on vehicles, and that's how it's transported. And it's a very difficult virus to control, and you end up doing whole herd euthanasias when they get this virus, when they're piglets, for example. So that is one. Diseases from the environment transmitted via people. And this is the classic example here is influenza. Even influenza, it is in the environment a lot of the time. The highly pathogenic one is not always in the environment, but the low pathogenic that can turn into a highly pathogenic one is always circulating in wild waterfowl. So, and that is, people have moved that, have been the source of that, and moving that from into barns, especially in the last few years with these avian influenza outbreaks. And then diseases from animal products or feed transmitted via people. So this is one that you may not think about. And there's the don't pat pork on there. So in African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, those are not in Canada. Those viruses are not in Canada yet, but they can survive processing. They can survive freezing. So, I mean, and that one of the most likely ways that will come into Canada is in meat, probably like sausage or processed meat, and people are eating the meat, and then they're done with the sandwich, or some of it drops out of their sandwich, a pig eats it, and then that pig can be infected with that virus that has been living in that meat. Neither one of these causes disease in humans, but it does cause severe disease in animals with severe economic impacts. And I'll just go through a few barriers to biosecurity implementation. So one of the big ones here is people related, surprise, surprise, biosecurity risks that have happened. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple studies. There is a study that showed that a lack of a hygiene barrier in the broiler barn entrance increased the chances of Campylobacter, which is a bacteria, contamination by it was more than 3 times. So this is just by that hygiene barrier can be like the barrier that is there before you get into the barn or the area where the animals are. Sometimes it's even just a red line, but it's to remind you that you need to take off your dirty boots or change your cover or put your coveralls on. So just by doing that one step, you can decrease bringing in this bacteria by a significant amount. And then there's another one study with Campylobacter again, and this it causes diarrhea and vomiting, and it's not fun to get, but it's in a lot of poultry they have Campylobacter just regularly. And so just by people washing their hands, changing their boots, and using a foot bath, there is a decrease in contamination by 5 times. So just by doing those little things, I mean, they do take time, and that's where the compliance comes in. If you don't follow the standard operating procedures, they're not useful, but they do have significant impacts. And monitoring biosecurity is needed to maintain compliance, just like so audits end up happening in a lot of these different commodities just as a part of being a producer, and especially supply managed commodities as well as the pork industry. But if we're not monitoring, even if the producer is doing everything possible to try to prevent disease, if you're not taking a look at things like the video, I mean, the red hands, the red feet, you don't actually see where the mishaps are happening. So proper changing of footwear and good hand hygiene show the highest breaching probability, and in some ways ironic because you think those might be the easiest to implement, but in other ways, I mean, it's difficult. If you're a producer, you're going in and out of the barn a few times a day. It takes time and it's a lot of effort, and also you have to think about it too. So you can see where those mishaps would happen. There is a clear need for engaging awareness and training campaign for farmers and their co-workers as well as transporters to promote good practices in biosecurity compliance. And again, you're not on farm and you're not going to be telling the farmer what to do as far as practices, but just to know that there is value in doing these practices. So insufficient knowledge of biosecurity issues and low awareness of benefits tends to go along with poor compliance. If you're not knowing why you're doing things, or if you think it won't actually have an effect, then you're not necessarily going to do them. With not that it's a good thing, but I mean, with all the highly pathogenic avian influenza that was hitting barns, producers really started taking biosecurity a little more seriously. I mean, they were already, a lot of them were already doing everything they could, but just the fact that your entire flock could be dead in 4 days if you're not, and this is your only line of defense, then things become real and you pay a little more attention sometimes. Substantial biosecurity breaches were observed when farmers, co-workers, and transporters entered and left the ante-room and/or poultry unit, or introduced young stock or bedding material to the poultry unit. So these were taken from studies looking at research in biosecurity. And so the anteroom is the room before you enter the barn. So again, here's your last stop before entering the barn. It's your last chance to leave disease outside the barn, or your last chance to bring it into the barn. So it's understandable that this could be an important area. And then additionally with the young stock, so that's one of the ones, the naive animals, young animals, if you're ever when you're looking at flow practices or when you're visiting barns, moving from young animals to old animals is the way you would want to look at it in general, just because the young animals more naive, oftentimes haven't been exposed to as many viruses or bacteria as the older animals, and so they're going to be hit harder potentially when you bring in pathogens or diseases from outside the barn. So a few take-home messages here. Biosecurity measures are performed before, during, and after farm visits, and then just keeping in mind that risk assessment before your visit, the separation and leaving vehicles or items outside of the outside of the yard or outside of the barn, whichever, just so you're not giving them the chance to be contaminated with any pathogens, and then cleaning and disinfection afterward so that you're preventing taking any disease off farm and you're protecting yourselves and people around you. Remember why biosecurity is necessary. So for human and animal disease prevention, focusing on boot changes and hand washing prior to entering and exiting facilities. This can make a big impact on preventing bringing disease in and preventing bringing it out. And make time for biosecurity measures on farm. This is the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and keeping that in mind as you end up having to take more time and being a little more meticulous, but it is worth it in the end. So we will go on. We had a couple questions here, but we can take any questions now, or we also can answer these questions that were sent prior to the webinar.
Let's start with the one sent prior to the webinar, and then we'll see if we have any questions after.
Sure, sounds good. I'll take this one, Tara, and you can take the second one. So the first question that we had come through was, when does an operation become, or when is it classified as an ILO, or intensive livestock operation? So the classification of ILOs falls under our Agricultural Operations Act, and we have a unit within the Ministry of Agriculture Livestock branch that specifically looks at ILOs. So in accordance with this act, operations are defined as intensive if the livestock confinement space per animal unit is less than 370 meters squared. So it's not necessarily about the number of animals that are present on that premise, but it's about the space that each animal has. So in that definition, it talks about animal unit. And in our act, those animal units are defined as 1 cow, 200 chickens, or any other poultry species, or 6 feeder pigs. So that act kind of outlines that description. And if the operation meets that definition, then it needs to be classified as an intensive livestock operation and be regulated through that Agricultural Operations Act. Under that act, there's also some provisions about the storage and management of livestock waste to ensure water resources are protected. And again, the Agricultural Operations Unit within our branch oversees the enforcement of that act. So they work with producers as well as RMs and the Water Security Agency to ensure that all ILOs gain approval before development can occur. So if you do have any questions regarding intensive livestock operations or how that act is enforced across Saskatchewan, we do have the Agriculture Operations Unit phone number there, or you can find us, just Google that Ag Operations Unit on our Ministry of Saskatchewan website, and you'll find it there too.
So the other question that was asked was, for animal welfare situations, what do you do? So for example, animals packed in too tight. Do you report these situations, and to who? So good to ask that question. So yes, if you have concerns regarding space requirements, animal health, or animal welfare, Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan is responsible for enforcing the Animal Protection Act 2018 for farmed and companion animals. So there is a new enforcement agency that we'll be referring to in the future, but you can report those concerns. Concerns regarding possible animal abuse or neglect should be directed to this agency. So information on space requirements for farmed animals can be found within the code of practice for particular species of interest. So each species does have a code of practice and recommended practices, or in some cases recommended required practices that should be followed. And then the website is there. So as a pest control officer entering a livestock facility, it is important to remember that you are a stranger and a potential threat to animals within. The animals will behave differently with you present than they would with familiar workers or while no workers are present. So, I mean, it's a big one for, depending on the species, the animals can bunch up. they can move towards you, move away from you, and that happens. It happens especially in poultry, for example. You can get pile-ups, and you can have 100 of them suffocate or die, because when you enter, depending on where the birds are at the time, and just if they are ready for this, then they will all bunch up and go all pack up in a corner. And so, I mean, that's not their behavior, but that's their reaction to whatever is happening. So, and then the requirements too is important to keep in mind, just because it depends. There are different requirements for different species. New or strange people in the barn can cause animals to crowd or pile up in an attempt to move away from your presence. So as a result of these unusual behaviors, it may appear that the animals do not have adequate space. I think that was...
Was there just two?
Yeah, it was just the two.
Okay, perfect. We do have one question, so I'll read that out for you. Thank you both for that wonderful presentation. First of all, I learned a lot, so I think that's great. So hopefully the PCOs and everyone attending did as well. Okay, so the question is for PCOs that are inspecting yards with no animals, so for example, bin yards. What level of biosecurity do you recommend so they do not negatively impact outdoor areas with animals?
Yes, so I mean, and it's a good question. Like, there's a lot of situations where you're not going to know the history or what's on farm, and then when it's an empty area, is it really a concern? But just the basics of clean footwear is a big one, if you can, whether it's booties or whether it's changing and having boots that are just designated for farm visits. That's one thing that I would recommend anytime. You know, that is something that you can do as a prevention. It's not going to hurt anything. It's not, and also it doesn't add too much to what you need to do. I would just mention too, with all our talk about the booties, I've been there, and definitely even telling farmers and producers, you don't want to create hazards. So in the, you know, when it's slippery outside, you don't want to be wearing booties outside. That's not going to be a good thing. So in those situations, you definitely need to do what's safe for yourself. And in some cases, you won't. In many cases in the wintertime or springtime, you won't be able to wear booties safely because you just can't stand up. And so, I mean, in those cases, you want to think about bringing your own boots or cleaning your boots at least.
Perfect, thank you. One more question. Is there any other disinfectant that you recommend other than bleach?
Yeah, so if Tyra just scrolls back to that slide, and the slides are also provided as well. So underneath that disinfectant tab, there are some RTU, which means ready to use solutions, and we have them listed there. So those are the names of the solutions: are Virkon, Excel, Peroxigard, or Viricide. And again, it's just really depending on what sort of risk is available and what sort of disinfection or disinfectant you would need to kill that pathogen. And like Tara said many times, we are not expecting anyone to be an expert in this field. So you do have our emails. We're happy if you reach out to us and say, here's kind of the situation. We could describe the potential risks, the potential diseases that you may incur while you're on that premise, and then we could recommend one of those from the list. But just in general, I think most of those are pretty general disinfectants that you could use. And just be careful when you're buying them, because some come as a concentrate. So that concentrate would then need to be diluted down into a spray bottle or into whatever method you're going to use to deliver it. And other are sold as RTU or ready to use. So that means you take the spray bottle, you could spray it directly onto your boots or onto your tools to do that disinfecting.
Yeah, the hydrogen peroxide products like Peroxigard, for example, are a common one. Virkon, in some cases, will come in a tablet, and you end up adding the tablet to a certain amount of water. And then when that color change, it's a pink color, and it can be bright pink from the beginning. And as the color changes, that will indicate it's less effective. So some of those are a little difficult just because of the length of time that they are good for. And then you also have to think about, you don't want to be touching, like Vircon, for example, if the powder, you don't want to be getting that powder in your eyes or in your nose or things like that. So some of these powder disinfectants, when they are concentrated, you don't want to be inhaling that. You want to take precautions not to touch those.
Okay. I think we just have one last question for you, so we'll see if anything else pops up. Is there any special risk from moving from like one species of animal to another in your day? For example, bison, sheep, anything like that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good thought to definitely, if you're thinking about sheep and bison, malignant catarrhal fever is something. It's a virus that sheep can have, and they don't get sick, and they have it, and you don't even know they have it, and then they can spread it to bison, and bison will die from it. So that is one of those that that potentially you'd want to avoid. I mean, if you could, you would want to avoid it, but you're not going to know everything. And that one too, if you actually look at the disease in more detail, there's situations where there are a bunch of sheep that have it, and then it spreads very easily to bison. And there's other situations where it doesn't spread easily. And so that one's a little bit weird sometimes when you're talking about spread. But and there are other ones. There's in turkeys and chickens, for example, there's a parasite that chickens have, and they are fine and they don't die from it. And then turkeys, you spread it to turkeys and they can actually die from it. So there are some. It's a tricky one, because again, that's a kind of another next level of expertise, and there are a few general ones. But I mean, if you have questions, you could always reach out to a veterinarian, or whoever in the situation might know a little bit more, or sometimes the farmers will themselves. Like, I mean, even just asking them, like, are you concerned about any diseases? Are you concerned about me bringing anything on your farm or things like that? Because that way, even if there's things there that they don't know about, if you ask them, then you've covered what you can, covered your bases there by asking them and following their wishes.
That's actually a good follow-up. Is there anything else that our PCOs should be asking when they visit the farms, to the producers, to the farmers? Anything that you recommend them asking about?
I mean, it's hard for us to recommend. Yeah, recommend anything, because we don't really know what your standard operating procedure is right now as a PCO. So one of the things that we had kind of chatted about with Colleen previously is, if there was interest from the PCO organization as a whole, is we could help to draft up some standard operating procedures, and you can provide to us what PCOs are doing now, and if there's anything that needs to be adjusted or added to that, we would be happy to review and then send that back.
Perfect. No, that is great. I think you've been in contact with the SPCOA as well, so.
Yeah, they asked and let us know about the annual conference, and it sounds like we might do a similar presentation or slightly different topic at the annual conference as well.
So they're definitely the great resource for our PCOs. All right, so I think that's all the questions we have. So we'll wrap things up there. I just want to give a big thanks to Tyra and Michaela for putting together this excellent webinar. It was absolutely fabulous, you guys. There's some clapping hands coming through, little emojis, so that's super cute. But yeah, thank you everyone who attended. We really appreciate you taking your time to be there as well. Oh, more come in. Oh, gotta love our people. All right, everyone, have yourself a great day, and hopefully no one gets hit too bad with this storm that's coming in.
Definitely. Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.